Hello, everyone. My name is Alexis Gooden. I'm Curatorial Research Associate at the Clark, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to this virtual presentation of a lecture in conjunction with the exhibition Nikolai Astrup, Visions of Norway, which will be on view at the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown through Sunday. This program is supported by grants from the Asbjørn Lunde Foundation Incorporated, the Norwegian Consulate General, New York, and the Dr. Lee McCormick Edwards Charitable Foundation. We thank them for their support. Today, we welcome Patricia Berman, who will place Astrup's work in a wider Scandinavian art context. Following the presentation, Dr. Berman will answer questions that you submit via the Q&A function on Zoom. If you're watching today on Facebook Live, please type any questions you might have into the comments section, and we will ask those of Dr. Berman as well. This event will be recorded and archived on our exhibition website at clarkart.edu. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Patricia Gray Berman is a Theodora L. and Stanley H. Feldberg Professor of Art at Wellesley College in Wellesley, Massachusetts. She specializes in the art and visual culture of the late 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, with particular focus on Scandinavian art, as well as European art, mid-century modern American painting of the 20th century, and photography. In her research, writing, and curating, she explores issues of national identity, gender and sexuality, and the problems of public space. Dr. Berman received her BA at Hampshire College and pursued her master's and PhD in the history of art at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. At Wellesley, she teaches at all levels of the curriculum, including surveys of modern art, contemporary art, and a history of photography, as well as upper-level seminars, topics which include propaganda and persuasion, the Bauhaus, nationalisms and modern art, installation art, and the body in modernity. From 2010 to 2015, she held a faculty position at the University of Oslo in Norway. She continues to be part of a research project she worked on there entitled Edvard Munch, Modernism and Modernity. Her publications include studies of the artists Edvard Munch, James Ensor, and of Danish painting in the 19th century. Dr. Berman is also involved in curating exhibitions, including Munch, Warhol, and the Multiple Print, which was held in 2013 in New York and Ankara, Turkey. Luminous Modernism's Scandinavian Art Comes to America, a Centennial Retrospective, 1912 to 2012, at the American Scandinavian Foundation. In Munch's Laboratory, The Path to the Aula, the Munch Museum, Oslo, in 2011, and Edvard Munch and the Modern Life of the Soul in 2006, the Museum of Modern Art, among many others. In fact, Pat was just traveling and was in Denmark installing the experimental self, Edvard Munch's photography, at the Willumsen Museum in Denmark. This exhibition is actually virtual too, so if you're curious, you can see representation of these works of photography taken by Edvard Munch on the Munch Museum's website. It was my pleasure to walk through the exhibition of Nikolai Astrup, Visions of Norway, earlier this summer with Pat. And I learned so much from looking at these works and discussing them with her, and I'm excited to bring her to the podium today, where she'll be able to give us more context about Astrup and the Nordic painters working at the same time in their quest for forming a national identity. So really, thank you, Patricia Berman, for being here today on Zoom, and we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you so much, Alexis. I hope can you hear me well? I think
yes.
So. I hope so. Hello, audience. I'm really honored to be here. I'm actually in my quarantine apartment right now in Oslo, from which I'm speaking. And Alexis, I do want to begin by thanking you for the walkthrough that we had together. I want to also thank Marcy Roberto for providing photographs for this lecture, and John Carson for managing this Zooming. I speak as the exhibition is soon to close, and now we have the benefit as an audience, all of us, of reading the catalog published this summer and listening to the lecture by Marianne Stevens that's posted online with the Clark. She was the exhibition curator, as well as other materials available online that the Clark has provided for us. There's a lot of biographical information available in the catalog and the extremely informative website both of the Clark and the Astrup Research Center in Bergh, Norway. So I'm not going to focus on Astrup's biography particularly, and I'm going to create a kind of a curious way of looking at his works, because I do want to talk about Norway's artistic communities and historical activities that kind of coalesced with and informed Astrup's practice, and the ways in which his work contributed to really important discussions of nation building in Norway. Let's see. So, whoops. Okay, there we go. I'm hoping my PowerPoint is visible. So Astrup's work conjures forbidding mountains, of course, flower fields, verdant gardens, human seasonal rituals of planting and harvesting, and celebrations such as Christmas and Midsummer Night. And his work in all areas is concerned with the material culture of West Norway. In fact, Astrup was insistent that he focus in his work on his home region, the mountainous area in southwestern Norway, a bit north of the city of Bergen, a narrow lake at the base of the highest mountainous region of Norway, often understood to be Norway's so-called spine, as though the country is a body.
Patricia, sorry, Pat, I hate to interrupt. We can't see your slides.
Uh-oh. Bear with me. Thank you for letting me know. Let me try this again. Sorry, folks. Do we have slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for
Very
not letting me ramble on far too long.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's great.
No. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm sorry about the glitch. So as I was saying, Astrup brings us mountains, seasonal activities, flora, fauna, celebrations throughout the year. And I ended that with a reference to his Midsummer Night representations, which fill the final room of the exhibition. And all of the works are concerned with the material culture of Western Norway. And in fact, as I was saying, Astrup is insistent that his work focus on his home region. It's a mountainous area in southwestern Norway, a bit north of the city of Bergen, as these maps indicate. A narrow lake at the very base of the highest mountainous region of Norway, long understood to be Norway's spine. And it's fed by Europe's largest glacier. Astrup was brought up in a tiny community on the rural lake of Jølstervatn, moved around that lake a few times and built a property on a wickedly steep hillside on the south side, on the side of the lake of Jølster. And there, as the exhibition traces, he, his wife, and his children built a productively working farm and gardens that both sustained the family nutritionally and economically, and became a central motif in Astrup's later work. And I think I catched this photograph actually from the photo murals that are lining the Clark right now. It's the very place and space of Western Norway, of his home district, of his home, that was crucial to Astrup's practice. And he wrote, quote, I quote, and I show you here, "I've attempted to express some of the kinship with nature by which we can be overcome while roaming the Jølster countryside. The smell and feel of old heathen and ancient religions, the land filled with legend, and the frequently crude colors, all of these are more important to my art than as mere subjects of my pictures. I," he wrote, "am perhaps one of this country's painters closest to the soil." I begin with this quote, and it also initiates the catalog of this exhibition, because I really want to consider that phrasing. Roaming the countryside, the smell and the feel and the colors of a place describe human sensory experience, touch, smell, sight, and bodily movement. And they're all visceral inputs. Interwoven with the immediate physical senses, however, is a different kind of receptivity, that of the imagination, of legends, of so-called heathen and ancient religions, which are in Astrup's description projected to be present in the land, invested in the land. And this is a kind of deep history, or the sensing of deep history. Considering a landscape as a cultural place is a kind of, we'll call it a national stratigraphy, the study of layers of unpacking or unpeeling what can be seen on the surface to reveal hidden layers of history and collective memory. The artist noted repeatedly that he sought, quote, authenticity, a kind of unschooling, to see as a child rather than through the formulas taught in art schools. And others claimed that because he was of and from the district, he had an inherent antenna to register the seen and the unseen. He was seen as the ultimate authentic West Norwegian artist. As art historians, Kija Eidesen Halversrud and Tove Haugsbø have brought forth in their recent PhD work, Astrup was preoccupied with the ways in which memory could be held in the present through acts of conscious recollection, through photography, and through art. They proposed, for example, that the moody paintings produced by the artist with their gray tonalities and with which Astrup, the son of a Lutheran minister, represented his childhood home in his father's parsonage on the left, that the graying tells of the reclamation of memory and the impossibility of childhood recall. The paintings of the parsonage in which Astrup was raised filtered as though through a gray scrim, or abandoned and seen through a window as a child here on the right and a detail on the left. A child endeavors to see into the darkness, speak of the instability of recall. Close looking at this painting reveals that the house mirrors the landscape in its blackened windows, rather than disclosing the hidden interior. It's a kind of double landscape of memory, recall, and the impossibility of seeing. Now, these scholars and art historian Francis Carey also analyzed Astrup's revisitations of his childhood drawings and writing that he maintained in scrapbooks, remarkably. Astrup's childhood scrapbooks are rich sources of information for his biographers, just as they were for the artist himself. And in his books, as we learned from this exhibition, Astrup wrote vivid descriptions of particular places that he cataloged for future use as motifs and sketches that he revisited that fed into his later work. The concern that Astrup expressed repeatedly for kind of authentic vision, for seeing like a child, for touching something outside a kind of educated experience, and for the acculturated way of seeing and knowing nature that was specific to his home region, is also important to consider in relation to art theory during his lifetime and the generations previous to Astrup, in the theories of design and decoration, in landscape theory, and in nature building efforts of Astrup's country people. And it's within this arena of folk collecting, of archaeology, and of historical recuperation that I offer here as a context for some of Astrup's practice. So I'm going to offer a little background, and I entitled this talk Astrup, Land, Landscape, and Nation. And I wanted to make a few clarifications about that. I want to locate Astrup's work within the context of his contemporaries in Norway, but particularly within the project of political nation building in the later 19th century and the early 20th centuries. And in this, I want to amplify some of what Robert Ferguson wrote in this exhibition catalog accompanying this show, and draw some additional connections between Astrup's work in paint, prints, and preservation into the larger political arena. To that end, I offer a few definitions that are perhaps pretty obvious, but I thought important to set out right now. I want to make a distinction between land and landscape. Land refers to a physical place and space, and landscape, the poetic or artistic naming or framing of land, is a human-made activity. A landscape is in the first instance a human invention filled with meaning that can change person to person, moment to moment, culture to culture. It's an invented meaning for a site. Once pictured or mapped, in the first instance, land becomes landscape. I also want to locate the idea of the nation within the definition of a kind of scape. Bear with me for definitions one moment longer. Following Benedict Anderson and other scholars of nationalism, I use the definition of nation as an idea rather than a place. Nation refers to a community of people sharing a common identity and rituals, and sometimes, but not always, sharing a common physical space. A nation is an imagined community, according to Anderson, bounded by stories, rituals, and common practices. And when I speak of nation building, I refer to a collective political will exerted by a group of intellectuals in the 19th century, including artists, to solidify and sometimes invent these common practices and stories that would make Norway the land into Norway the nation. And in this next lecture, this next 45 minutes or so, I'll first discuss the importance of landscape representation to national self-identity and to the nationalist movement, the contributions of visual artists to that effort, and then discuss national preservation movements, both of which arenas Astrup absorbed and famously contributed to. Astrup is an interesting artist for any number of reasons, but I'm really intrigued by his efforts to integrate modernist art to be modern, and at the same time to be a historical preservationist. We often think of modernism in art as a kind of progressive, experimental set of practices, a fight against historical norms. For example, the kind of Cubist-inspired painting of Axel Revold, a Norwegian artist with whom Astrup had some relationship after the turn of the century. Preservation is profoundly invested instead in making historical materials vital for the present. And Astrup, like his colleagues across the arts, formed a kind of preservationist modernism that continually struggled to reformulate land as landscape and Norway as a nation. Norway was not a sovereign, a couple more definitions, then we'll move on, I promise. Norway was a sovereign nation until was not a sovereign nation until 1905 when it achieved independence from Sweden. Norway had been an independent kingdom until the later 14th century, when it became allied with Denmark and Sweden. In the 16th century, Norway became absorbed into Denmark, and its official language, bureaucracy, and institutions became essentially Danish, including, and the Reformation was particularly brutal in Norway, which included the destruction of many of its historical edifices, including its stave churches. Denmark was allied with France during the Napoleonic Wars, and at the conclusion of those wars, and under the Treaty of Kiel, Norway was taken from Denmark and ceded to the Swedish crown. And in 1905, Norway separated by referendum. From that time, in 1905, through the early 20th century, and reaching back into the early 19th century, a network of Norwegians in all fields of endeavor worked to identify traces of pre-Danish Norway, to retrieve and bring together evidence of what they called authenticity, untouched culture that had not been Danified, to create a narrative of a once pure Norwegian culture. These intellectuals identified Norwegian farmers living in the deep valleys and resistant mountainous terrain as carrying the ancient Norway into the present day through the very agency of their bodies and their rituals. And I'm showing you one of the most valorized paintings from the middle of the 19th century by two artists, Adolf Tiedemann and Hans Gude, which kind of is a machine for identity formation. There's a little Stave Church in the background. There are these wooden boats, giant mountains, clouds rising up, water, a bride, a man playing a local hardanger fiddle, and so on. There's the rocks, the foliage, everything here speaks of place. And it was a kind of painting that, like many others similar to it, were understood in the first instance to be teaching mechanisms as well as aesthetic mechanisms. The visual arts and the preservation of material culture were of the utmost importance in nation building. Landscape painting had particular resonance in Norway, as it often does within national identity movements. To picture the land was to picture both the past and to inform the future of the country. Norway understands its own art history to be rooted in the generation of artists who studied and lived in Germany before there was a formal, and Denmark and Germany before there was a formal art school at home. Among those artists, Johan Christian Clauson Dahl lived in Copenhagen and then taught at the Academy in Dresden. He painted heroic views of southern Norway, focused on mountains, often crashing waterfalls, resistant rocks, and then, of course, the farmers who worked the land. A close colleague of the German Caspar David Friedrich, Dahl is understood to be a founder of the Romantic landscape tradition in Europe. Not only was Dahl a profoundly important painter, but his own collection became the foundation for the National Gallery in Norway. With the establishment of the first National Gallery in the 1830s, the first generation of nation builders began to amass a national visual culture. Dahl also had an archaeological imagination, as in a painting dated here from 1831 of a tree, a famous pilgrimage site for artists, a tree that grew out of a prehistoric burial mound connecting the past with the present. In winter, the tree endured despite the blistering and desolate cold. Dahl had added a stone monument, a menhir, here in this painting to this picture of a tree, even though other artists who painted the site suggested that menhir didn't really exist in real space. But this 1831 painting is a kind of empathy machine, the one in the middle, with the stone monument marking a Viking grave, another grave mound birthing the mighty birch tree, a tiny farm appearing in the background, and the figures seen from behind in the foreground in the process of beholding the tree. The appeal to a living, preserved national history, the farm founded on its site, and the red-capped farmer, local, who brings a tourist to view this, to behold this site, introduces this meaning and naturalizes this kind of idea of immanence, the living past nurturing the present. What Dahl called the holy tree, this tree, became so identified with nationhood that a national romantic poet, Johan Welhaven, created a much repeated poem about the tree. This is the central rhetoric of nation building in the 19th century. And while you're wondering where Astrup is in all of this, it is this rhetoric of the past material presence of the land as a door to the future that he and his generation absorbed. This is what they learned. This is what their school books were filled with. These are the catechisms that they learned in school, the poems that they read, the songs that they sang. And it's not incidental that such a mound is present and perhaps emphasized in the woodcut, The Moon in May. And I'm going to discuss the variations of the print a little bit later, but I did want to just sort of focus on the mound that's presented here in Astrup's work. And this kind of mound that's pictured here is among the many historical and venerated relics that Norwegian archaeologists brought to light throughout the 19th century. The excavation of such mounds in the latter 19th century revealed, among other spectacular finds, the Gokstad ship in 1880 on the left, which is currently in the Norwegian Viking Ship Museum. And on the right, this excavation photograph of the Sohlberg ship, another Viking ship that was excavated from a mound. And while the ship on the right was being excavated, it was a tourist attraction. And among the tourists was Edvard Munch, who owned a small summer house near the excavation site and who we know went to visit it. And we'll turn to Munch as an artist a little bit later in his relationship to Astrup. In the 1830s and 40s, I'm reaching back to reach forward into Astrup's generation. In the 1830s and 40s, mapping and various modernization projects began to recreate Norway's mountainous regions into tourist sites. And a painting by Johannes Flintow from the 1830s kind of pictures both the stunning and forbidding mountains that you can see before these viewers and before us, waterfalls and glaciers, but also the tourists, some in beaver skin hats and citified clothing, who study a map and are guided here by a local youth. The Norwegian Tourist Organization Association was founded in mid-century in 1868, encouraging city dwellers to experience the mountains, to gain intimacy with their inheritance, which was the land, and to that end built cabins or reused cabins throughout the mountains for tourist purposes. And so the mountains became used, known, venerated, reproduced, painted, explored, and perhaps nowhere more than a series of paintings by the Norwegian artist Harald Sohlberg. From 1900 onward, he painted many views of the Rondane mountain range, another one of these mountains along the so-called spine of Norway. And with this one in particular, I've got a detail here on the right where there's a cross inscribed at the top of the mountain. So the mountains, became more than just land or landscape, but were invested in a sense of a kind of ownership that's hard to really understand outside of that context. Now, mountains, trees, mounds, waterfalls, glaciers, stone markers were animated by the rhetoric of a kind of living eminence, of a living history. At mid-century, the project to build a railway line to link Norway's west coast with its east coast, from Christiania in the east, which is the older name for the city of Oslo, to Bergen on the west coast. The railway line demanded slow excavation and much blasting across Norway's Rocky Mountain spine. Because of the concern with archaeological artifacts hidden under the mounds and scattered across the country, and in the interest of Norway's geological history, the railway hired a geologist and archaeologist to oversee the excavations. And this resulted in significant research about Norway's settlement history and major contributions to the nation's growing archaeology collection. So the ground kept revealing history. The search for physical evidence of Norway's prehistory led to the study of material culture actually in plain sight. In North Norway in 1895, rock inscriptions became of great interest, which is to say that they began to gain significance as living evidence of the past, and they were widely published in the popular press as well as in scientific publications. I'm showing you two photographs of one site that was of great interest around 1895. What's held in the rocks under the earth and the earth itself disclosed, in the words of mid-19th century writers, the very set soul of Norway, a form of ancestor worship, a kind of animation that brought forth the kinds of visions that Astrup also spoke of a kind of a pre-Christian, kind of heathen, pagan presence in the land, which we can always discuss later. Now, considering again the woodcut, The Moon in May, and its variations, Astrup was an invented graphic artist who both hand-painted his wooden matrices with dense oil-based paints to achieve multicolored impressions, and then he hand-painted his prints such that no two impressions among them, three that you see here, are the same. Variations in his prints invest different moods or suggestions into the motif. But I want to focus here on the print that I have over on the left-hand side of the screen, because this version of the moon in May, with its outlining of areas of rock poking through the snow, may be a very playful variation in which the snowfields coalesce into pictograms that literally mirror the ongoing archaeological discoveries being brought forth constantly from the 1890s into the 20th century. And certainly such suggestive forms are the very stuff of childhood imagination, like looking at clouds that resolve for us into giants or mice or whatever. Much can be said of a painting by Astrup from 1904. It's not in the exhibition, but it charms me for a host of ways. It intrigues me, of a young couple that are kissing in a cow barn among cows and cow droppings, with a somewhat malevolent figure up above that is looking down at them. I'm intrigued by this because on the floor, as though projected by the window and shaped by the cow pies, are those drawings again, those stick figures that resolve into the forms of projected archaeological imagination. It's as though playfully or intentionally or suggestively, Astrup, who was knowledgeable in all these fields, could imagine seeing as a child through the filter of kind of national desire and investing in some of his works a kind of text to be read in that regard. Now, thinking about his mentors, those who helped to form his vision. In the 1880s, a generation of artists, many of whom who had studied in Paris under sway of Impressionism, helped to forge a new landscape language that became a much valorized way of picturing Norway. And that is a kind of painting that can be identified with mood. In Norwegian, the word stemning, mood, such that the canvas communicates a sense of emotional investment as much as it does represent a motif. The registration of light and air and atmosphere was crucial to this. Erik Werenskiold, whose painting I'm showing you here, one of the leading figures in that generation, left Paris, returned to Norway, and stated, "We are in the process of creating a national art. The love of nature should lead artists to return to their home country, for they cannot understand and for this reason cannot love what is foreign to the same extent that they can what belongs to them." This sort of invocation to locality became the rallying cry of the generation. He and Kitty Hjelland created some of the most resonant paintings of the 1880s, when they and several other artists spent a summer on a farm in southern Norway, owned by the artists Christian and Maggie Skredsvig, focusing on the quiescence of the summer evening. In the summer of 1886, on that farm is a moment that's considered a turning point in Norwegian art, and one that was famous within the art community of Astrup's generation. This was the generation that artists his age looked to. Christian Skredsvig's work adapted the high horizons, softened backgrounds, and highly focused foreground figures displayed in the French artist Jules Bastien-Lepage's work. Such pockets of intimate space and differential detailing, foreground and less detailed background, extended naturalist painting into a kind of a symbolic realm. Some of the artists of that summer colony were Astrup's most important mentors and guides. Eilif Petersen, like Kitty Hjelland, focused on intimate views, close up, and not the grand vistas of the Romantic generation like Dahl. With a lack of anecdote and an emphasis on light and atmosphere, Petersen, the painter Gerhard Munter on the right, the younger artist Halfdan Egedius on the left, and the artist Harald Sohlberg redirected landscape into a kind of moodscape a way of seeing that was termed Neo-Romanticism, a way of seeing that is affective, in which the artist's emotions and the space and place and atmosphere of a locale come together. Now, as we'll see in a moment, these artists helped to engineer the first purchase of Astrup's work by Norway's National Gallery. These were his mentors. One of the great practitioners of mood painting from that summer of 1886, of suggesting a state of being through color and light, was Harald Boberg, with whom Astrup studied when he moved to Christiania between 1899 and 1901. In addition to her light-filled, kind of scumbled canvases, Boberg was one of the most important teachers in Christiania, receptive to new and experimental painterly languages, allowing for her students to explore languages of their own and not necessarily her way of being. One of Astrup's breakthrough moments as an artist came over the course of these, or I should say several moments of breakthrough, when he held a one-person exhibition in 1905 following travels to Paris and Germany, and then a return to his home in Ulster. Having in Paris found particularly inspiring the works of Maurice Denis, for example, on the left, with its generalized forms and intense unmodulated fields of color, and the simplified forms, linearity, and so-called childlike character of Henri Rousseau. And in Germany, the atmospheric paintings of Arnold Böcklin, which he said gave him kind of chills, Astrup began to experiment with a keyed up color palette and the generalized form that helped him to express his desire to kind of de-skill, that enabled him to express place and mood simultaneously. I wished, he wrote, to wash myself in the raw colors of Western Norway in order to cleanse myself of everything that I may have ingested from the art of others, in order to escape from all influences and arrive at my own style, somewhat mirroring what Werenskiold had said in the previous generation of coming home. And repeatedly in his writings, Astrup invoked the local, the unadulterated, the filterless receptivity to land and to history. His painting of 1905, his painting of 1905 of St. Hans Night garnered exactly the kind of nationalist rhetoric that secured his reputation as a modernist when he held a one-person exhibition at Blomkvist, Norway's most prominent art venue. And I'm showing you a sketch from around 1905, and I don't have the slide of the painting that was written about, but it's important that in April of 1905, at the height of nationalist will, and just prior to the referendum for Norway's independence, a reviewer in one of Christiania's newspapers of record wrote, quote, "The small painting of Midsummer's Eve is essentially a mood from the great collective memory, a mood of paganism and sun worship, alive among the simple people of today. This is truly one of the pagan residues left in the Norwegian people." Now, with this rhetoric of the simple people, the pagan, with the imagined ability not just to record what's visible to the eye, but to conjure the most desired ancient pre-Danish past in the western region of Norway, Astrup's reputation was secured just as Norway gained its independence. He was therefore received along with the nation as somehow a kernel of the nation itself. It's also the self-definition that Astrup shared with his friend in the 1927 letter that I showed at the beginning of the lecture. Astrup, however, was not isolated within his home or his district, nor could he be described as simple or childlike. The city of Bergen, the largest metropole near Ulster, was one of Norway's most cosmopolitan cities. A member of the Hanseatic League, Bergen has, for centuries, been involved in active trade across the Baltic Sea to Russia and across the North Sea to England and up and down the Norwegian coast. A center of industry, it was one of Norway's few art centers with an exhibition society and wealthy collectors and patrons. Occasional travel to Bergen and to Christiania, as well as travels abroad, brought Astrup and his works into contact with advanced work by both his mentors and younger artists, such as Axel Revold, the author of a fresco cycle about Bergen's industrial history in that city's stock exchange. And I'm showing you a sketch for that fresco cycle on the left, and then a photograph of it in situ. Which is now a restaurant on the right. One of the other artists who had intersected with Astrup's art in Bergen was Edvard Munch. While Astrup both claimed and was accorded a regional identity, Munch, likewise the beneficiary of Harriet Bakud and artists of her generation, was an internationalist. Munch emerged in the Norwegian art scene in the 1880s, sometimes with mood paintings or stemning paintings, such as this one, amplifying the notion of mood in the manner of Kielland and Bakud, while generalizing his forms and increasingly exercising a spontaneous paint application that to many of his contemporaries, including Astrup, appeared unfinished. I guess I'll show a relatively well-known painting. In 1898, in fact, Astrup wrote with not a small amount of jealousy, "Well, I cannot stand Munch. Everything he does is supposed to be so brilliant, but it doesn't have to be more than sketched." Astrup's later claim to be from, in, and of his region was opposed to Munch's cosmopolitanism. Quote, "It is my opinion," Astrup wrote, that artists should live in close contact with the land, and thus should be immune to harmful influences from alien art. He repeated this a number of times. Nonetheless, the two artists shared patrons in Bergen, in the Høst family. Isabella Wibe Høst was for years Astrup's patron and supporter, assisting him in his sales and network expansion. Her husband, Sigurd Høst, the headmaster of Bergen's Cathedral School, was one of Munch's close friends and an active promoter of his work. Astrup began to admire Munch as a fellow printmaker. Here in Norway, he wrote, "Munch and I are among the few who have occupied ourselves with the modern woodcut." And indeed, in 1909, Munch traveled by rail to Bergen, where he admired Astrup's woodcuts in Sigurd Høst's collection. Astrup could say with pride, "Munch is enthusiastic about my woodcuts and has acquired 3 of them." In autumn of 1909, when Astrup had descended into a depression, Sigurd Høst wrote to Munch, "I write out of consideration for a sick and unhappy man named Astrup. Now the only bright spot in recent times for him is that I told him this summer that you liked his pictures that you saw here in Bergen. In his last letter, he talks about his illness and his hallucinations, but finally mentions again how much it has meant to him in his terrible discouragement that you liked his pictures. Munch is known for stating his opinion ruthlessly," Høst quotes Astrup, "and therefore I dare to believe his words. Now, Munch, I would like you to send me a small statement about Astrup's pictures and the impression they have made on you." This is what he wrote to Munch. Høst repeated the request a few times. A letter from Munch to Høst indicates the following praise. "Well, abroad I often thought of similar deep moods and landscapes in Norway." This is what Munch wrote, "and had thought to just paint something similar. And then I see that Astrup has already been in on this," end of quote. Astrup quoted Munch to another friend as saying that Munch had said Astrup was the first who initiated Western Norwegian painting since the time of Dahl. There was a bit of admiration back and forth and a bit of competition. But certainly as printmakers, as J. Clark notes in this catalog, the two were unrivaled in their ambitions and complexity. In identifying their production as modern woodcuts, Astrup not only identified their aims to be the creation of graphic works that would equal the status of painting in facture and visual power, that their work was far more than illustrational, he also identified the parallel ways in which the artist treated woodcut potentially a reproductive medium, to be instead a process through which singular independent prints were made. Munch's process was less laborious than Astrup's, and his images were far more abstract. And here I'm showing you versions of the wooden matrix on the left and two versions of the print of the motif vampire, a woman initially kissing a man on the neck that then took on this horrifying name. Munch developed the process of cutting his motif into the wood, separating the matrix apart into sections with a fret saw, and then piecing them together again like a jigsaw puzzle, thus enabling multiple colors to be present in one press of the matrix. He also used raw wooden planks as matrices, emphasizing wood graining as a form of decoration that runs throughout his motifs, a means of dissolving the difference between foreground, where the figures should reside, and the background, or even the paper on which these images are printed. And in this way, Munch could make singular prints as varied as paintings, each distinctive. Astrup sometimes created multiple matrices for his prints, registering multiple blocks to layer his images. But he also, as in the case of Marsh Marigold Night here, he hand painted various parts of a single block, which you can sort of see here on the right when you look at the matrix, creating an astonishing range of colors. And then he hand painted his prints such that they can neither be understood as prints or as paintings, but as a kind of hybrid, as an integrated medium. Both artists adapted lessons from ukiyo-e prints, which circulated all over Europe, and which both artists studied, adapting the graphic pictorial structure and the hand tinting that creates variation, subtle or unsubtle, among the different hand-printed images. Astrup's moment of emergence onto the art scene, corresponding with Norway's new century, buoyed by artists who had studied with Harriet Backer, but also with Henri Matisse in Paris, such as Jan Heiberg, whose paintings you see here on the screen. And Munch attempted in some ways to shake the very foundations of the national self-romanticization. And these new artistic languages were both adapted by Astrup, but also threw him in relief as a regionalist who amplified the affective workings of his paintings and prints, an artist grounded in land, landscape, and nation. Now, Munch and Astrup also shared the idea that visible nature held fantastical valences. Munch's anthropomorphic renderings of rocks, as in this Mystery of a Summer Beach from the early 1890s, turn observable nature into a kind of a fairy tale kingdom, or an era of emotional instability, such as the scream. Munch wrote of this, in the nocturnal light, shapes have fantastic tones. The stones on the beach are like trolls. And of course, trolls, spirits that inhabited barns, rocks, and trees, and malevolent figures made of moss were central to the folktales collected by the nationalist linguists and orthographers Asbjørnsen and Moe, who, like the Grimm brothers in Germany, gathered and published stories of the fantastic hiding within the banal from the mountain valleys in Norway. These stories were published in numerous editions, illustrated by Norway's leading artists, but the best known among them was Theodor Kittelsen, whose images of transformative nature and mystical beings, such as the two that you see here on the screen, gave pictorial presence to the rural narratives and made them everyday images within Norwegian visual culture, both rural and citified. Astrup's own transformative images, such as the anthropomorphic grain poles here on the right-hand side of the screen, owe much to Kittelsen's imagination. Grain poles had long been part of the national romantic motifs explored by landscape artists such as Gerhard Munter on the left, or on the right by the Swede, Fanny Scherberg, markers of harvesting season, which were also represented by Astrup. But by creating a kind of animated hybrid between grain and animal, or by creating a tree that had been hand created into its form, Astrup participated in the realm of Kittelsen's fantasy of an animated nature. And in fact, Astrup's notion of the smell and feel of old heathen and ancient religions, the land filled with legend that he spoke of, is invested in such images. Astrup's admiration for Kittelsen's images extended to the man himself of whom he wrote. There's a healthy fantasy in his pictures, a powerful and characteristic craftsmanship. He is himself a son of the people, and therefore it's reasonable that he understands how to put himself in their frame and mind and the surroundings of nature. This is the way that the artist characterized himself. I now want to focus on Astrup's activities as a preservationist that intersect with his activities as a painter and a printmaker. He was a collector. One of his paintings on display in 1905 in his one-person exhibition was this, the storehouse in Julster that was used as kind of a advertising for this lecture. This painting pictures a number of rural buildings set in a mountainous environment, recorded in the shadowless light of an overcast day with a glacier just rising here in the background under the swirling sky. In the foreground is a storage house, Eitit in Sami and Stabud in Norwegian. The original title of this painting was Dismal Autumn Day, drawing attention to the weather, the season, and the mood, this mood painting, this notion of mood. But the newer title privileges the architecture and the geographical place, a storehouse in Julster. Made of hewn wood and raised above the ground by rocks to protect it from rot and rodents, the storehouse is not just characteristic of its type, but it had a particular national resonance. This painting was first purchased by Eilif Pedersen, mentioned early as one of Norway's most admired painters of the 1880s. And then at his insistence, it was purchased by the National Gallery in Oslo. This was Astrup's first painting to be given that imprimatur of belonging to the National Collection. Astrup remarked that it was his worst painting. The year of purchase was 1905, also the year of Norway's independence and a time of immense celebration. But it was also the year of the Antiquities Act of 1905, stating that all structures built before the Reformation, dating to 1537 by this act, should be protected. All storage houses from before the Reformation were automatically protected and were collected. And I'll talk about the museum collections in a moment. These storehouses from various districts of Norway filled the paintings and the prints of Norwegian kind of romantic nationalists. And in a sense, the storehouse became a kind of a shorthand image for historical Norway, for nation building. And, it's an aside, but one of Norway's common brands of food, which was established in the middle of the 20th century, is branded with a stabud, with this little house. I'm showing you a lunchbox. Norwegians probably don't think about it much at all. But when this was an established company, it was based on this idea of the stabud, of this rural structure as being a signal of Norway itself. Now, storage houses and other examples of rural vernacular architecture were collected toward the end of the 19th century into open-air museums. The King of Norway began to collect material evidence of the past on a little spit of land at the end of near the edge of Christiania in the 1880s, which became part of the Norwegian Folk Museum in the 1890s. I'm showing you a photograph on the left and a print on the right, picturing this first collection. The so-called folk museums in Christiania and then elsewhere in Norway and throughout Scandinavia, actually throughout Europe, offered places and spaces for urban spectators to both witness and sometimes enter into history when some of these collected buildings were opened up. One could touch and smell, and through the imagination inhabit these places, to be at home in the past, at home in the rural past. One of the most identifiable structures in the Folk Museum is the Stave Church, taken from the Hallingdal Valley and moved to Christiania. Following the Reformation, over 100 of these medieval wooden structures were destroyed, particularly in the 17th century. In the 1830s, the painter Johann Christian Dahl, whose work you saw earlier, chronicled the remaining churches in these prints that you see here, issuing a volume of highly influential prints. Dahl purchased the Stave Church at the town of Vang with his own money when it was threatened with imminent destruction, and he transmitted it to King William Frederick IV of Prussia, and now this church stands in Poland. Dahl, in turn, established Norway's Association for the Preservation of Ancient Monuments and Antiquities in 1844, one of Europe's first preservation societies. Now, as we know from the current exhibition, Astrup built his houses and gardens at Sandalstrand, the property he purchased in 1912, in the manner of historical farm buildings, transporting and reusing old timbers and other materials from local farm structures that had been abandoned or dismantled. And in the slide is, again, part of the photographic panorama from the Clark. Astrup's property consisted of several wooden structures, the last one completed that included his studio, and in its configuration of several structures, it reflected local vernacular farms and homes in both its division of tasks, the kitchen house, the barn, and so on. And it's significant that despite modern building techniques, the Astrups chose to build using particular kinds of technologies, using milled lumber as well as natural logs. This was a choice so that they would be invoking, using, and living within local historical structures. The turf roofs were also widely used in rural Norway. They were very practical, built of layers of birch, bark, sod, and plant matter, providing insulation against the cold and raw weather. But all of these details, all of these choices to live in a spirit of historical continuity, both was thrifty because the Astrups were reusing older materials, but it was also a matter of taste. Throughout Norway, there was much architectural material available for preservation projects such as the Astrups. By mid-19th century, Norway's rate of industrialization exceeded that only of Great Britain. With the growth of industrial infrastructure in the cities, there was much attraction for young farm laborers, especially those who were not likely to inherit any land due to the inheritance laws. The United States Homestead Act of 1862 offered cheap land in the Midwest, and between the 1850s and the 1920s, about 700,000 Norwegians left for the United States. 3 of Astrup's sisters moved, for example, to Brooklyn. This is all to say that older farmsteads, either abandoned or modernized, offered material for reuse and for collection into the open-air museums. When in the years after World War I, plans were put in place to create an open-air museum in his home district of Sandfjord, Astrup took an active role and donated a farm building to the cause. And here I'm showing you some older views of this open-air museum, some more recent views, and the celebration of the museum in 1926. Astrup also rescued local flora that was threatened by modernization. As is noted in this exhibition, a field of marsh marigolds, the subject of several of his works in paint and in woodcut, began to disappear as the wetlands were drained for agricultural use, for development. Astrup collected those and collected rhubarb specimens and other species, such that his garden farm was both sustaining for the family and a kind of historical seed bank. Now, the Astrups decorated their home with antiques and with local handicrafts and with materials that Engelunda Astrup, Astrup's wife, herself produced as a fabric artist, printing patterns for domestic use and for aprons used for special occasions in the national costume, local costumes. The printed fabrics, the weavings, and the objects of daily use that are shown in this painting by Astrup are a kind of demonstration piece. They're the kinds of productions that held a particular place actually in art criticism of the 1890s, and that paralleled from the 1890s forward the idea that artists' homes were demonstration pieces for ways one could live. So painter Gerhard Munter, who was a member of that 1886 Summer of Mood painting that I showed you, and who promoted Astrup's early work, built his home outside of Christiania and published it as a kind of a model home, this house called Leveld. He created a series of watercolors that he produced as prints as a way of suggesting how modern people might live with a kind of historical imagination. Now, he shared with Andreas Oberg, one of Norway's leading art critics and theorists, a belief that there was a native color palette and a local instinct for rhythm and decorations held by rural Norwegians. Munter was one of the country's leading decorative artists, invited to provide illustrations for the sagas of the kings, such as the one that you see here on the left, a collection that Astrup had been invited to contribute to, but chose to withdraw. He was also the creator of a number of murals and of fabric art, and his thick, linear, geometricized forms, such as the one that you see on the right, characterized both his book illustrations and then entered into Norway's most important monumental painting when he was tasked with decorating a medieval feasting hall in the city of Bergh, a preservation project of the early 20th century, and one that was well known and financed by some of the people who were collectors in the city of Bergh, both of Astrup and of Munch. Both Munter and his wife Sigurd were also textile designers whose work was highlighted internationally around 1900. And in both his work and his publishing, Munter offered the kind of retrenchment in art and design in which the ancient so-called instinct for form and color would revise an art that was inherently Norwegian. And this is, of course, the rhetoric that was adapted by and digested by and then put forward by Astrup. The art critic Andreas Oberg also concurred, stating in a series of important articles that rural farmers living in the deep valleys of the spine of Norway, held the key to a kind of true aesthetics, a true local aesthetics. One article entitled "In Farmers' Homes" stated that interior decoration by mountain farmers in that spine of Norway, spared of cosmopolitanism, offered a path toward a kind of true national school of art, based on, he said, instinct and based on preservation. Oberg proposed a kind of naivete, a kind of unschooling, a way of seeing and shaping the world without recourse to advanced training. And around the time that Astrup moved back to Julstad and resolved to advance a kind of modern art that would not be touched by fashion or formula, he could be seen to embody and bring forward the ideal modern preservationist, enlisting the rhetoric of the 19th century and insisting on his regionalism. Although with the training of a cosmopolitan, he was a designer and an engineer of antique material culture. His aspirations to express kinship with nature not only animated his flattened, colorful works, but they operated within and fulfilled the aspirations of the national narratives of his generation, which came to fruition just as he began to be a player on the Norwegian art scene. Thank you. I look forward to questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Pat. That's amazing. I learned so much from you. I'm particularly blown away by the pictograms in the Moon in May series. And I will be able to ask you a couple of questions off the top, but I'm going to give people a minute or two to type in any questions that they might want to ask of you in the chat on Zoom or on Q&A. Both of those are working. And if you're on Facebook Live, please add your questions to the comments field, and we will get those relayed to Patricia Berman as well. But yeah, those pictograms are really fantastic. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how people received these. Were these published in articles? Were they illustrated in books? How might Astrup have seen these? Did he travel to that site in northern Norway firsthand, or did he hear about these through other people talking about them? What was the reference point? I'm really curious.
So Alexis, thank you for that question. These were published really widely. They showed up in children's books. They were in the newspaper. I mean, this was kind of like a find, even though they were known to local people in northern Norway. But when they became kind of scholarly interest, it was evidence of the past. So they were reproduced all over the place. And in one of them, you'll see there were sort of red outlines, which has been something that's been done over time in all of these rock paintings to make them visible for tourists. Astrup didn't travel to find them or see them, but they became part of a kind of cultural imaginary. And I'm trying to think of what the equivalent would be, sort of for us, us in the US. But, to think about images that become kind of emblazoned in the imagination because they are part of like a national visual vocabulary. So they were in the scientific literature, but they were also in popular literature. And I find these kind of fun and sweet that they're sort of built in, certainly to that floor in the courting in the cowshed. But the more I looked at the variations in the prints and the way that Astrup was playing with sort of the outlining of the rocks and the snow in the back of those prints, if we all visualize them. There's so much variation in every aspect of those prints, but that one in particular where he outlines the rock formations, and they appear to be deer and bison and other creatures. I think he was being enormously playful and playing around the edges of this kind of idea of cultural ownership.
Well, it's just fabulous. I can't wait to go into the galleries again and look at these prints and see those pictograms for myself. I've looked at the prints before, but I haven't noticed that, and I didn't have that context. So that's really meaningful. I have a couple other questions coming through here. Compliments to you for a terrific talk. Someone is intrigued by the quote in the exhibit from Astrup about his poisonous greens. Could you talk a little bit about that sentiment?
Well, there are a couple of things to say, and one is going to be super geeky and the other maybe more realistic. One that's super geeky is that green actually was made of arsenic, various kinds of green, literally various greens were literal physical poison. And so that to enlist the color green sometimes, I mean, it's certainly not natural. There's trees, there's flowers, there's fauna, there are grasses. Those are green from photosynthesis. But sometimes artists would use the color green as a kind of a signal for a poisonous kind of interior. And also, just to make, this is geeky too, I have my colleague, Alison Moorhead, has written about this, that women stopped wearing green clothing because it was understood to actually damage them, to damage their bodies. The other thing about poisonous green, and some of those landscapes, like the rainy day landscape, is so dense and so enveloping with all of those variations of green that it kind of takes over your consciousness. So those are the things I guess I think about. Other people probably have different and better answers, but I'm intrigued by the arsenic piece and the modern pigments that then tried to remediate that.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you can say anything about Astrup's health, if you know very much about his asthma and his tuberculosis, and he actually died of pneumonia in 1928, and how that might have affected his relationship with Western Norway's land and climate. Were these things that did they limit his activities? Was he able to explore the world as he wanted to, or was he more confined to the inside world when he was not well? If you could maybe elaborate a little bit on how perhaps through his health he participated in or didn't participate in the landscape.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think the answer to that is sort of both things, because since he was a child, he was enormously ill, and attributed that in his writings to having grown up in that parsonage, which was kind of rotting from the inside. So trouble breathing since a child, with bouts of terrible asthma and lung infections and tuberculosis. And once your lungs are compromised in that way, even with mild asthma, you're always at risk for suddenly not being able to function, not being able to breathe. So being outside and breathing clean air, and the air is so crisp, is beneficial. But at other times when the air is really cold, it triggers your problem. So I think both things, being out and walking up and down that hillside, because the place where he chose to live was like vertical, up and down pathways, and working in the garden would have really built his body. But then at other times, he did suffer from terrible attacks. And then as well, I think, Sigurd has mentioned to Munch that Astrup was struggling with depression. He also struggled with terrible depression on and off throughout his life. So both things kind of attacked him. And there were periods of immense productivity from what I can see and from what I can gather, and then periods where there was just an absolute decline and absolute frustration at not being productive. So it's like, I remember, it reminds me of the novel Heidi, that Swiss novel. I think it's probably way out of fashion now, but where the young girl with a lung ailment, this urban child, is sent out into the countryside, into the mountains, to gain her health, which was also what was happening with all the tuberculosis clinics worldwide, that you'd either with TB, you'd be sent to the mountains or you'd be sent to the seaside to cure yourself. So he was living in his own, curative environment that sometimes attacked him, I think.
Thank you for that. I have a question about a quote that you used, and moving forward with that. This question says, you quoted Benedict Anderson's imagined communities at the outset to frame your approach to nationalism. One aspect that Anderson emphasizes is the role of print capitalism and language reform in developing national identities. What was the role of the Norwegian language reform, for example, bokmål and nynorsk, on Astrup's art? Is there a connection? And maybe you can explain what bokmål and nynorsk are for our audience too.
Yes, absolutely. So in the 1830s, when there was this sort of generation of landscape painters and folk collectors and material culture collectors and archaeologists who began to try to collect scraps of ancient Norway, there were orthographers who traveled around to collect what was understood to be pre-Danified Norwegian language. Bokmål was a language that was understood to be associated with the Danish bureaucracy, so sort of High Norwegian. Nynorsk, or New Norwegian, began to be a language that was formulated out of an earlier 19th century collected language called landsmål, bokmål, like book learning, and landsmål, taken from the mountainous countryside. And there, landsmål was sort of a collection of dialects that were brought together from communities sort of outside of the Danish bureaucratic control, and that was forged into what was understood to be a kind of a more authentic language in the middle of the 19th century. Nynorsk was a reform that kind of formalized this language into the 20th century and is almost like a separate written language. One is associated more with the left, the political left has been historically in the 20th century, Nynorsk, than the higher, Bokmål. And so this language reform, orthographic norms that were reestablished, the separation from Danish orthography was absolutely part of this nation building enterprise. And print capitalism, the publication of newspapers and magazines and the role of the press and the growth of small publishers and art publishers was part of this enterprise. Not only, and of course, alphabet books and children's books and so on, all kind of explosive in the middle and the later part of the 19th century.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Here's one. Do you know where Astrup bought his paints? Is there any correspondence between him and his suppliers? So how did he get his materials when he was living in Western Norway, which was relatively remote, I understand, although there was a steamer on the lake when it was warm enough, and there was a road that went through Aarhus when he was growing up on the north side of the lake. But if you know anything about how he got his materials, we'd like to know.
I can't say that I have an answer to that question. I just don't know. But because he did travel to Bergen, which was a major trade route with England, and he traveled to Christiania, I imagine, I'm guessing, others of you out there who know more, you can just chime in and give an answer. But within Bergen, I know that there were British pigments that were imported directly. And I'm guessing that some of his pigments just came directly from these visits. He probably, I'm guessing, having looked at his palettes, that he also bought powders and mixed his own, because powder is quite stable. And so once you mix your own paint, there it is, and you can have your powdered pigments, or you can grind them yourself from local flora, which he sometimes did do. And it would be pretty stable, and you could have a pretty big store of it. That's my guess, but somebody else can answer that question much better than I can.
I think that's great. I know from a previous talk, Jay Clark was speaking about the prints, and I know that some of his papers came from agents, people he corresponded with who were living in Bergen or elsewhere. And so, yes, I'm sure he had a network of people who could help supply him with materials. Do you know off the top of your head where that fantastic cow barn courtship painting, that's a tongue twister, where that painting resides? Is that at the Bergen Museum? Or
I think it's at Bergen, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So that might be at Coda Bergen. We have an attendee who would like to go see that, hopefully in person someday, when quarantine is not an issue, when COVID is a thing of the past, when travel's easier again.
Yeah.
But I think go ahead.
I was just going to say, you can, if you visit the Astrup Research Center website, it's a fantastic source for locating works there. It's part of a catalog raisonné project. So whatever has so far been fully cataloged and authenticated is right there online. And then the site is also mentioned.
Well, that's fantastic. So Pat, thank you so much for your lecture today and for answering these questions. A lot of compliments in the chat feed, the Q&A remarks. So I'm not alone in thanking you for your time today and for giving us a better context of Astrup and Norwegian artists and the quest to build a national identity, both not only in paint, but in printmaking and in building moving and building and museum forming. It's been really an incredible talk. So thank you for adding to our understanding of this artist. I just want to mention again to those who are seeing this live on Tuesday, the 14th of September, that there are a few more days if you're in the area to see this exhibition. Nikolai Astrup Visions of Norway will close this Sunday at 5 p.m. And from that moment, it will travel to Bergen, Coda Bergen, where it will be on view for about 4 months. And then from there to Stockholm, Sweden at the Prince Eugen's Valdemar Suda Art Museum. So it is traveling, but we do have it here in the States for another few days. And we're very grateful again for the sponsors who helped support this lecture, for Marcy and John for helping with the technical aspects of the lecture, and for Pat for zooming in from Norway to be with us today. And thank you to all of you for being here to watch this webinar. And again, this is going to be on our website at clarkart.edu very shortly.
Thank you so much.
All right, well, you have a good,
Alexis.
Thank you, exactly. And have a good evening in Norway. And thank you again for being here.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.